Welcome all of the viewers today, and if you're on YouTube, we welcome you as well. After the video event, the broadcast, which is live, we hope you'll join us in future ones. If you're on YouTube, come to us and give us your email, and we'll tell you about all the events coming up so you don't miss something like today. And so, as Bjorn said, we have Michael Vorenberg here today, a professor of history at Brown University. His writings have appeared in the Chicago Tribune, New York Times, Washington Post, Politico, and elsewhere. He's the author of Final Freedom, The Civil War, The Abolition of Slavery, and the 13th Amendment, a key source, by the way, in Spielberg's Lincoln film, and also the Emancipation Proclamation with documents. But his latest book is called Lincoln's Peace, The Struggle to End the American Civil War. Alfred Knopf publishes it. It's 438 pages and illustrated, and is $35. And as Bjorn mentioned, you have our special book plates signed by Michael. We thank you to place in them, so you have really a signed book. Well, we have a lot to talk about here. And so, Michael, let me ask you kind of succinctly, why this book now?
Well, the first thing I really want to say is how nice it is to be in the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop again, although this time virtually. I've been there a few times in person.
Yes.
So I want to thank you all for having me and for talking about the book. For those of you who are watching and don't know, this is really one of the most revered institutions by historians who work on 19th century U.S. history, and there's just nothing like it. So it's great to be associated with it, and to just think that my book could be sold there is very special. So why this book at this time? Of course, when you send a book off to get published, it goes into production, you have no idea what's going to be going on in the world when the book actually comes out. So I can't take credit for any kind of timing. I have noticed that when people talk to me about the book, they say, how timely a book? And then I ask why, and I get different kinds of answers. But I think the general answer I get, and really probably the most common question is, aren't we about to have a civil war? Or is this still the Civil War going on? Or are we still struggling to end the Civil War? That's the title of the book, Lincoln's Peace, The Struggle to End the Civil War. So I think in terms of timeliness, that may be it. I think also when I started that there was a different kind of timeliness, which had to do with ending wars. And I was very much paying attention, as were many people, to issues around when and how the U.S. would withdraw from its engagements in the Middle East. That was very much on my mind when I started my research. And thinking about the way that was handled by President Andrew Johnson after Lincoln's assassination, how Johnson wanted, of course, to pull out the troops rather quickly, and Congress was going against him the other way. And so that struggle to put an end to war, at least war powers, that happened then. And of course, it was happening now. Now, I guess I'll finish with this note that we really are in this kind of moment in a way, because if we think about that deportation that happened fairly recently, and the executive order itself, the legal rationale for it is an invasion. That's how you invoke the Alien Enemies Act. That's one of the ways you can invoke the Alien Enemies Act, and it's the way that President Trump did it, was by invoking an invasion. So that is similar to saying we are at war. It's not the same. It's not the same. We're just saying we're under a state of invasion. And then you run into this problem, right, which is how and who is going to say, right, when the invasion is over. If we're under invasion, when is the invasion over? Mm-hmm. Now go back to 1865, when this book sort of begins. If we're still in a state of war at that moment of, let's say, the Appomattox surrender, when is the war over, and who gets to say it's over, and how does that declaration get accepted, if it gets accepted?
All right. So before you answer all my questions, let me ask you a couple of things about the book itself. You begin the prologue with an epigram from T.S. Eliot. And taken from Ginning, I even put the lines in, uh, and this is what the epigram says at the beginning of the prologue. To make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. Now, you then end the book in the epilogue with another T.S. Eliot epigram, also from Little Gidding, and it says, the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Do these bookends encompass the theme of your book then?
They definitely encompass a theme.
Mhm.
Very grateful for T.S. Eliot to have written the four quartets, which is that you're reading from one of the poems. And that set of poems is filled with references to time and considerations of how time works. So it worked very well for me. Yes, so if I start with your first quote from Eliot, I will riff on it just a bit and say that if our end is our beginning, what does that mean? So when we think about the Civil War, we're thinking about a lot of things at once. And one of the things we may be thinking is about the ending and what that moment is of an ending. Most commonly, that moment is the surrender at Appomattox. That particular ending, which is really, I would argue, definitional. I mean, the image of it is in so many American history textbooks. It's in film. There's an opera made of it, the surrender of Lee to Grant. So it has this role of actually defining the whole war. It thus also tells us what the war was about from the beginning, right? So if we have an image in our head of two generals essentially coming to an agreement, then that's defining the war as a war about armies who break and fight, right? Who are fighting to one another, and therefore that defines the war. And that is an argument in the book, that when you choose an end date for the war, whatever end date that is, or however you envision the end of war, you are in effect defining for yourself and maybe for others what the war is about. So yes, that is definitely a theme. And then the second quote is just, after all these pages, and you said it's over 400. I just don't want people to be scared. A lot of those are notes.
Oh,
It's not.
our
It doesn't have
clients
to
are
be too long.
readers, don't worry.
But it's a hefty book. But after all that work, what have we learned, right? And we've learned a lot. But we've learned one of those things is that now, having looked at all these different endpoints and false endings and restarts, we now know the ending better than we did at the beginning. It's really that straightforward as a historical project.
I'm going to go back because these are subject I want to get into a bit. I want to get into the book itself for a moment still. You have a notes on language at the end. Uh, Speak to us briefly about that. I want to get to the other things as well, but speak to us briefly about the language issues that you had in the book, especially, of course, the N word and the word master. We here at the bookshop, you as an historian of that period, run across both those words constantly. They were part of the milieu of the day, and they don't really grab me, maybe as they do others, because I see it so often. So tell me from the notes of your book, use of language in your book. Do anyone reading it need a safe room?
No,
Good.
I don't think there's any language there that's going to strike anyone as unfamiliar. What has happened is in the past decades is that writers in general, certainly historians, have been a little bit more attentive than they were before to the work that language can do, both good and bad, and language, can strike a certain tone. So I'll just give an example. The word slave is a word I use. But you see, if you stop and think about it, slave acknowledges that property can exist in person. And if we today want to say that that is unnatural, right? And then we might not want to use the word slave. We might prefer something. The more common usage now among academic historians would be enslaved persons. I use both, but that's the kind of philosophical issues that arise over what might seem like an obvious word. And master is something you mentioned. So master suggests that the person is a master both before and after, let's say, emancipation. And that's a problematic term because after all, after emancipation, mastery is supposed to be over. But in fact, of course, mastery is not entirely over. So I end up using the word master sometimes also because that was the word that was used at the time quite often by formerly enslaved people to describe their former masters. And by the Army especially. The U.S. Army would often talk about masters. But those sorts of words in any academic book, you can usually find some discussion of that. Tough decisions have to be made. I don't think my decisions were particularly brave or cowardly. I think where things get interesting for me in the language issue was, what do I do with the word appomattox? So in my teaching, I'm constantly saying things like, after Appomattox, this happened. And that's a shorthand way of saying after the Civil War, or this is a post-Appomattox event. Again, after the Civil War. And my whole book is interrogating the notion that you can use a moment or place or event as an endpoint. And yet there I was. So in writing the book, I had to be really careful about that kind of thing, because I would be then undercutting my own argument that you have to really think about and interrogate these various endpoints.
So let me begin this way. How do you define civil war? And do other differing points of view produce different conclusions? But how would you define it?
Any civil war, you mean? Or
Well,
this civil
maybe the
war?
American Civil War. How would you define that, since there doesn't seem to be an endpoint and people today are coming up to you and saying, aren't we still going through that? Aren't we, maybe we not have another one, although it's going to be, if we do have one, it's not going to be the Mason-Dixon line, it's going to be bloody Kansas. Your neighbor is going to off you in the middle of the night.
Right. I really think a civil war, in the most general way, is a struggle over the nature of the government under which a people live. That's it. And that's a very vague and purposely vague definition. It's a struggle over the government under which they live. And when we use the word war, that struggle is, of course, military. It's not just, let us say, a vicious political campaign. It turns into war. So the war part. So it's a struggle over the nature of the country. Now, I mentioned it so broadly because let us think, for example, about the contrast between something like the English Civil War and the American Civil War. So the English Civil War is in many ways much more of a classic civil war, whereby there are different parties who are trying to gain control of, let us call it, the central government. In the US Civil War, the Confederacy, at least what it's saying, is it doesn't want control of the US federal government, although ironically it pretty much had it almost until Lincoln was elected. It wants its own country. It wants out. It just wants to be allowed to go. That's actually a sort of very different kind of civil war. That's more what we might think of as what they called it, a war of secession, right? And so it is a war of secession. It's a war so they can break free. But I would argue that a war of secession is also a war that is about what does this country look like? What does the United States look like? If the Confederacy, right, becomes its own country, they're going to call itself the Confederate States of America. They're going to have they have a constitution that's mirroring, that is imitating the U.S. Constitution. The form of government, that's not exactly the same. There are some differences. So they are saying we are the true America, right? We are the true America that aligns with the America that was created in 1776, or if you want to say 1787, if you want to go to the Constitution. We are the true America. And the United States under Lincoln is saying, we are the true America. So who's right? And, that requires a war. And so secession is part of that debate. And with other civil wars, you don't usually get that kind of geographic, let's say, break.
Yeah, I wonder if the Civil War is totally a geographic break. Certainly today is, again, people coming up to you and saying, is the war really over? We had a woman come in today from Eastern Tennessee just a few hours ago. And Eastern Tennessee used to be a Union during the Civil War area. That's why Lincoln Memorial University exists, because Lincoln wanted to help education in that part of the country after the war. And O.O. Howard did that. But she says today it's a lot different. And she said a lot of people around me say the war is still going on.
Yes.
The Civil War is not over. So, and certainly I would say today maybe for the Black population, it may not be war over yet, as far as they're concerned, because can the Civil War really end then? What about culture and society and ideology and way of thinking? You look at, you quote Edward Pollard from The Lost Cause. I'm going to use a quote. The war did not decide Negro equality, did not decide Negro suffrage. It did not decide states' rights. And these things which the war did not decide, the Southern people still cling to, still claim, and still assert them in their rights and views. That was in 1866. And then after that, he said, the South must wear the crown of thorns before she can assume that of victory. Avery Craven said, until the Negro's place in American life was fixed, that's when we can say it was ended. So how do you see an end of this Civil War?
That you just gave an impressive string of quotes from the book. So thank you for bringing those up. And each one sort of deserves attention. So I won't be able to give the attention each deserves.
Overall.
Yes. But it does, what putting them all out there does, right, is show you how right from the start there is an awareness among some, not among all, that the war isn't quite over. And I would put that a little bit differently. That is, there's an awareness that the war is not over simultaneously with calling Appomattox, or something like Appomattox, maybe the surrender of Joe Johnston a few weeks later, the end. So the idea that these two ideas can inhabit a single mind simultaneously. One is that the war is over, and two is that something like the war continues. That would seem like, how can that be? So F. Scott Fitzgerald, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who said, the sign of a true genius is to be able to hold two competing ideas in the head and not go insane. And I think that's what we do as Americans. We hold these two competing ideas in our head. Did the war end? The war of the 1860s, right? Yes, it ended. We can debate and talk about when, but did something like the war continue? Yes, it did. So my answer to your question is that the Civil War ended, and it did end. I'm not going to give you a single date when it ended, but I would say certainly by the 1870s, or let's say by the 1880s, it's over. I actually stopped the book in 1867. I would argue I use that as an endpoint because I'm so interested in who gets to call it over, or who's in charge of the war. And in 1867, what happens is that Congress seizes control of the war from Andrew Johnson. It is now a war that is to be controlled by Congress completely. And that changes things. And so Congress now gets to define when the war is over. And Congress will define the war is over in 1871 when those representatives from the seceded states come back.
The last ones.
The last ones, right. They had started to come back well before then, but that was those are the last ones. So when do I say it's over? For me, I spend a lot of time talking about, well, when's the last battle? When's the last surrender? What about these war powers? How long do these war powers last? But you'll notice in nothing I've said in the last 5 minutes or however long I've been speaking did I mention slavery and emancipation. And yet, the cause of the war by 1865, unquestionably, for the Union, is the destruction of slavery. Maybe it's not for moral reasons, as one might hope, but certainly it would be for the notion of you have to destroy slavery so we don't get another war. And it is still the cause of the Confederacy to support slavery. That is obviously clear. If you look at the debates in the Confederacy around arming, either emancipating and arming black people or not emancipating them and arming them, it's incredible the pushback against it, desperate as they are for manpower. So it's a war about slavery. It may not have started out that way in the minds of all, but it's clearly a war to destroy slavery. So therefore, if you define war as the attainment of a war's objective, then the war shouldn't be said to be over until slavery's over. And now we've entered into a whole different question, which is, when is slavery over? And that's a question I ask often.
Sort of slavery. There is economic slavery as well as bodily slavery. And maybe that has not ended. It's interesting. I was thinking what you were saying earlier, that an electron is, strangely enough, in two spots simultaneously. And I agree with you. We humans can be like electrons and encompass two thoughts simultaneously. Lincoln was one of those. And I think that slavery was, even though he was saying union at the beginning of the war, union, he was also being political. I thought as well that slavery cannot be taken away from his thoughts on going to war if necessary. And the war came, he was ready to let it come. And so he, I think, didn't think, he was ready to, as he said, keep it here if that puts us together, or do this or do that. But he also felt that slavery might not end until the country, we bind it into the South, keep it there, and over time it will end. I don't agree with that entirely, frankly. I'm not sure he was correct on that, but he was trying to avert war and perhaps in time end slavery.
I completely agree with you about his view of things. And the electron analogy is a good one. Of course, I don't want people to think they have to know quantum physics to have to understand the book. So I don't use it, but it's actually very good. And the idea that an atom could be, or an electron could be in two places at once is quite useful. What you said about Lincoln, I agree with, but I think we also have to be a little careful, because you're a little close to that argument that says Lincoln spoke out of both sides of his mouth, right? Which is that, no, I'm not saying you said this, but there are those who say this, right? Okay. And of course he did sometimes. The most obvious or maybe famous example is during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where when he's in northern Illinois, he'll sound a little bit more radical, a little bit more almost like an abolitionist, and then when he's down in Charleston in Illinois, he'll sound a little bit more conservative. Right. So Lincoln, of course, is often accused by historians and by his critics of speaking out of both sides of his mouth and saying we should destroy slavery, but then to another audience, let's focus on union. I'm not saying that you said that, Daniel, but I'm just saying it's much more subtle, and you're getting at that subtlety. It's both, and fused in his mind, or not fused, but better, that quantum example is kind of good, sort of both at once that aren't quite the same thing. So what do we do, with someone who, in his second inaugural, gives the most extraordinary statement about how this war must be a war to destroy slavery, no matter what it takes, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid with a drop of blood drawn with the sword. And he's talking about war that could go on for hundreds of years, an apocalyptic kind of war. So how do we reconcile that Lincoln with the Lincoln, who, if you look ahead or behind a few weeks, you can find him saying things that are hardly that destructive. They're much more open-ended, or actually in the second inaugural itself, right? But with malice toward none. How do you have a position of with malice toward none if you're going to be taking away the economic foundation, the identity foundation of white people, that is slavery, racial slavery? So in that speech, the last two paragraphs, you have that duality right there. He wants it both. He wants it both, absolutely passionately wants it both, and thinks both can be achieved. Could it have been achieved the way he was going? And you had some doubts, and I have doubts, because he really believed, as you said, that slavery would have gone away by itself. If it hadn't been for like a small upper crust of white planters, pro-slavery types, exerting a disproportionate amount of power. And he used this word, he would use the word delude, that they were deluding the common white people into thinking that this is somehow in their interest to support slavery. So Lincoln's notion is to always, from the beginning of the war, if you can separate the mass of whites from those people who are deluding them, then the war will end. And I think with Reconstruction, again, he put his faith in the common white people that, they would wake up. They would wake up and realize they'd been led to the war by these people. I think Lincoln was a bit naive on this front. I think he didn't understand just how deeply culturally embedded these ideas were in the larger white population.
Exactly. I agree with you on that. And remain, maybe not vis-a-vis slavery, but certainly degradation. It remains. Now, but there are some at the time during the war and after the struggles, the military struggles, and afterwards, that had to define the end of the war. I'm talking about the pension office. Now, here's some of the people who had to struggle with who got pensions, and maybe just briefly again, tell us, how does Lewis Grant fit into that?
My book begins with a prologue that tells the story of Lewis Grant. And Lewis Grant is no relation to Ulysses Grant, but he's a huge fan of Ulysses Grant. Lewis Grant is much younger than Ulysses Grant. Lewis Grant is not someone we should know. And he was an officer in the U.S. Army. And it happened that he was at Appomattox Courthouse on the day of the surrender. I came across Lewis Grant sort of by accident, and he had written a report. He had been given the assignment by his superior. So his superior was the Secretary of War in the early 1890s. And the task was, go figure out when the legal end date of the war is. What had triggered this task was a pension issue. Basically, you're paid more for a pension if you've seen wartime service than if you haven't. So that being the case, if you're asking for a pension, you're applying for a pension, and you want it to be a war pension, it's important that your service meet the dates of the war. It's an incredibly technical thing, but it actually then matters a lot that you have dates to work with. So that's one example. I could give other examples why dates matter. So that small little question leads Lewis Grant on this journey, this research project, which I come across. It's a huge file of his notes and then his final report. And I can sort of watch this man struggling with this because he had been there at Appomattox. And now he's looking at these different events and he realizes, wait a second, there's still stuff going on. And at the same time, he's seeing that other people have defined the war as ending. Let's say early on, he learns that the War Department has been using May 1st as an end date. And he cannot, for the life of him, find out why it's May 1st, 1865. And he says, my department, my War Department is making it up. So it's things like that. But I'll give one other example because it isn't just pensions. Here's where things could really matter, right? Let us say you sign up or maybe you re-up for your service as a volunteer in the Union Army, in the U.S. Army, for 3 years. And let's say it's 1863. Or let's say, here's a better example, a black soldier, because black soldiers don't start coming into the U.S. Army until, in a very large way, until 1863. So enlistment papers at that point typically say you are serving for a term of 3 years or till the end of the war. And so what happens, right? So Appomattox happens. And then a few weeks later, the surrender of Joe Johnston to Sherman. And these soldiers are hearing that the war is over. They're reading in the newspapers that the war is over. By the terms of their service, they're done, right? Because it's sort of like, which comes first, 3 years to the end of the war? So a number of people begin to go home, and they are arrested for desertion. And they say, but the war is over. And their superiors say, no, it's not. So that this isn't just an abstract question, right? This is a very serious question in terms of when do people get to go home? And they don't get to go home, right, until that 3-year term is up, which is, let's say, I don't know, middle of 1866, or until somebody with authority says that the war is over and it counts, and then they can go home.
Yeah.
So this has real meaning at the time.
Yeah, and Kirby Smith is out there, and there are we'll get to the Native Americans in a moment as well. But I know it was central to my argument on the military tribunal that tried the Lincoln conspirators and hanged some of them, because there were many who was thinking that, well, if the war is over, civilian courts should be there. But I contend that Kirby Smith and others were out there still, and they put together a military tribunal because the commander-in-chief, if the war is still going, has just been killed, and there are armies out there still. So it's a military. So I've used that for that regard as well. We have a slide, Bjorn, showing 2 plaques that you have in the book. And apparently there was a dispute as to what the very last battle of the war was. And here are 2 of them right here. And both of them seemingly perhaps wrong, especially if we put in the Native Americans and
Yes.
you expand into the Indian Wars that followed during Reconstruction as well, if not after. How do the Indian Wars and before and during still produce something of a civil war?
Okay. So I'm now going to hit 3 topics kind of quickly because there are actually 3 things you just hit that I want to talk about, and they're sort of different. You mentioned the tribunal that tried the Lincoln assassins as they have to claim that it's still wartime. So there's a chapter in my book that's called The Final Trial, and it's not about the trial of the Lincoln assassins. It's mostly about the trial of Henry Wirz, the former commandant of Andersonville, the POW camp, who was tried by a military tribunal.
Just very quickly, a side note, he's buried in Washington, D.C. in the same Catholic cemetery as is Mary Surratt, because they were both Catholics. They were both buried there. I visited them just about a year ago.
Yes, I mean the story of Wirz, the trial, the execution is extraordinary, and it fits so well into these issues of ending wars. I'll point out that, when we think of what marks the end of a war, one thing that often happens with the end of a war, especially a civil war, but not always, maybe it's the end of any war, is hanging of the perpetrators, or punishment of some kind to the perpetrators, right? So we might, if you've seen images, let's say, of the hangings that follow of Germans or of the Japanese after World War II. They're not mass hangings, to be sure. So Wirtz stands in, really, for the whole Confederacy, I argue, as his hanging, because, of course, Jefferson Davis is never hanged. But back to your point, he's tried by a military commission, and his defense counsel, the best argument the defense counsel has is a very good argument. So this trial is going on after the Lincoln assassination. Edmund Kirby Smith has surrendered. So the Confederate armies have all surrendered. And so that's the argument. What's going on here with the War Tribunal? So the judge advocate, both the judge advocate of the case, Chipman, and then his boss, Joseph Holt, have to say that, in fact, we're still in a state of war. So they have to say that. They have to state it in order for this trial to be legitimate. A quick hit on those two plaques. Those are the two sort of classic battles, land engagements. And one, just to tell folks how this could be. They're very far apart geographically. They're 1,000 miles apart. One is the Battle of Columbus, April 16th, so only about a week after Appomattox. That's on the border of Alabama, Columbus, Georgia. And that's a real battle. And I won't go into details. The other battle happens about a month after that, and it's on the border between Texas and Mexico. It's in Texas, in Palmito Ranch. And there are some who argue, yes, there was fighting, yes, there was skirmishing, there was even somebody killed, but it really was just kind of the kind of skirmish you get you get after a war. It's not a real battle. But as you saw on that plaque, they call it a battle down there. And the official records of the War of the Rebellion, I'm sure you know what those are, many, many, many volumes, they report the records of that battle, the Palmito Ranch. That's May 12, 13. And they write, as a kind of note, this is the last battle of the Civil War. So here again, it's like, who gets to call it the last, right? Now, you bring up these other ways of thinking about battles and fighting. Because meanwhile, the U.S. Army is fighting wars in the plains against the Sioux and Arapaho. And they're fighting, or at least policing, we can say at the very least. That's a nice term for what's going on in New Mexico under General James Carleton in New Mexico Territory. This effort. I'll focus on New Mexico and then I'll stop. So New Mexico, that project that's what Carleton really sees it as, a project to, as he would put it, civilize the Navajo. But really, it's a relocation project away from their homelands to the Bosque Redondo, and it's what the Navajo will call the Long Walk. It is a forced relocation and then a policing and carceral kind of situation, with people resisting, and the resistance to break out and to go back closer to Santa Fe is then there's fights that break out. So this is going on in New Mexico. There's a set of Civil War troops in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. These are men. I'm thinking here especially of a couple regiments from Michigan who signed up to fight Confederates. That's what they thought they were signing up for. That's what they volunteered for, right? And it happens over the course of the war that the war in the East is basically coming to an end, and they're ordered to Fort Leavenworth. So they go to Fort Leavenworth. Now they're in Kansas. And that's not so strange, because there is a lot of guerrilla activity still in that area. But then comes the order that they're going to go to New Mexico. And in New Mexico, they're going to have to fight Native Americans. That's where the men protest. And they say, wait, the war is over. And the authorities say, no, it's not. The war is still on. You signed up for this many years. We didn't say that you're fighting specifically on this enemy as opposed to that enemy. They're all enemies. And so you're going to go to the Southwest. And so there's a march down to New Mexico, and whole regiments desert rather than go fight. But that's in the book too. And but so that speaks to your point about how, yeah, the real fighting's going on, even as people say, what's going on here? I thought it's over. And then they're being told, no, it's not.
I want to use your professorial skills as a professor here and ask you, we have two books here. One is Ella Long's Reconstruction in Louisiana, and also James Garner for Mississippi. So my question is, if you're talking to your students, uh, are these still relevant for students to grapple with and look at, or do you just view it as propaganda and we shouldn't? They're classic works. Certainly Ella
Yeah.
Long is classic.
Yes. So these are books of what we call the Dunning School. These are historians either trained by John Dunning at Columbia or by maybe some of Dunning's students. And that the Dunning School is famous or infamous for providing a history of Reconstruction or general kind of template that is the template of Reconstruction for many, many decades and lingers still in popular culture in certain ways and in many people's heads. So the Dunning School has many elements, which I won't go into great detail here, but a couple that relate would be that the problem that the biggest problem with Reconstruction are those who would reform the South. So the so-called radical Republicans, and then black people themselves, because black people so want the argument, and here's where racism comes in most directly and obviously. Black people were not ready for Reconstruction. They were not ready for full membership as in the polity. So this is strewn throughout these books. So we could then dismiss the books entirely and say, well, that's garbage interpretation. We have much better books about Reconstruction to go to. And I would agree with that. But the thing is, though, we should never forget that that history existed, because vestiges of that history remain. So one of the vestiges of that history is that the radical Republicans were too radical. And if Lincoln had lived, his moderate quality would have moderated the radicals, and so Reconstruction wouldn't have been so bad, right? That would fit rather nicely into certain types of Dunning School interpretations, that Lincoln might not have been so bad as the radicals. Well, if you think of Steven Spielberg's 2012 film, which is fairly recent, that's a part of the film. That Thaddeus Stevens stands as this radical, and Lincoln's the moderate, and there's a clear message, at least to me, that had Lincoln lived, maybe Reconstruction would have been smoother, maybe faster than had he died. Maybe that might be in the film. One of the things about those books, so there are two things that are useful about those books and why they should always be kept around: to remind people of the history that was taught, because we can always go back, right? That history, just because we're telling it differently today, doesn't mean that it's going to be told this way 100 years. We could go back to that. I hate to say it, but that could come back. So it's important to remember that history can have these cycles, and we don't want to. I certainly don't want to go back to that. The other thing is that for all that the Dunning School was problematic in interpretation, they were really good about basic, boring facts. So if you want to know little details, like who was the Secretary of State of Mississippi in 1868, right? This like a functionary. Those are actually the books you end up having to go to often to find out these little facts, because it was all about this kind of very positivist view of history. It's all about the facts. It's all about the facts. So no fact is too obscure. Get it all down. Every member of the legislature, I want charts at the end. So actually, they did a lot of digging into those sort of archives that I would find incredibly tedious, I have to tell you, if I had to do it. So it's actually kind of useful to have some of those facts there.
Now, another fact that you put into your book is kind of interesting. Apparently, it took different parts of the country, different time periods, to realize that blacks were no longer slaves. So Kentucky, Arkansas, Texas, they didn't think that yet. I mean, no, we still feel that they were slaves. Um, so where did that perception last the longest? That blacks were still slaves. What areas have I just mentioned them? Other areas, specific areas that felt that much longer, and Reconstruction then was a moot point almost.
The word slavery is really an important word here because there's even been a book called Slavery by Another Name, right? So how important to answer your question do we want to focus on the word slave? Are people really saying, "Oh, there's still slavery here"? Because often what you
What were
have,
they thinking?
and
They were
I will,
thinking that. They weren't
yes,
thinking today.
that's right. And so what you get are forms of servitude, often racialized servitude, convict labor that's racialized. Some people argue that today's prison system is in a way has its origins in the slave system. I think that's a line that's sort of hard. It's not a straight line, but maybe it exists. But now I want to answer your question directly. Like, okay, no one questions that slavery exists as a legal as an institution that is legal in the states where it exists, let's say at the start of the war. So when does it become illegal? When is it, and that differs, as you say, depending on region. And it's not like there's different moments that you can identify. There's just certain people that refuse to give up slavery. The only way to really for slavery to end is for all parties to agree that it's over, and then for force to be involved to ensure that it's over. That's a lot, right?
Yeah.
So for the enslaved people to say it's over, that's important, and that happens before the fighting even begins. That is, there are enslaved people across the South who, when Lincoln is elected, they say, well, these white masters have been saying all along that if Lincoln's elected, slavery's abolished. So Lincoln's elected, and they say, I guess we're free, right? That's a perfectly logical conclusion. Obviously, it's going to take a lot longer for the white Confederates to accept the end of slavery if they do at all. But the key part here is force,
Yeah.
because they might say, a former slaveholder or a white person, that, oh yeah, sure, I know, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, or maybe later, the 13th Amendment is ratified. They may say that. They may even tell an Army officer that they accept it. But do they really believe it? And so in the book, I have a number of these episodes, right? So the Army comes into the South in, let's say, May of 1865, and they're marching through western Louisiana, let's say, or Texas. And well, actually, let me leave Texas aside for a moment, because that is the state I want to end on. And they'll go to a plantation, the Army will, and say, okay, they'll proclaim, that, make sure that everyone knows slavery is over. And quite often the former master will stand on the porch and will read some statement saying that, yes, you are all now free. Army moves on, leaving no army present. And then what does the master do? He says, guess what? You're still slaves, right? And so you find this all the time. And formerly enslaved people are saying, we had to be emancipated or declared emancipated like 3 or 4 times before anything happened. So it's a process, right? It's a process that requires force. In Texas,
I'm just going to
Texas is
go.
the most remote, and so Texas, it's the hardest. It's the hardest place, and that's why when we talk about Juneteenth, it's not coincidental that Juneteenth is a Texas moment.
I was just thinking of Edna Medford and her saying, well, it wasn't the armies freeing us. We freed ourselves. We took our legs and we went north or into the army encampments. So there's always that. And I was really going to start out, go back to when can we say that the Army began Reconstruction? Because fairly early, before Lincoln, certainly after emancipation, Grant was using blacks as armed guards for plantations around Vicksburg. And that's before Stanton was okay with it. I don't think Lincoln maybe would have been if he had been apprised of it like that, but Grant was using it. So the Army almost began emancipation by using former slaves, freed people as armed guards.
I agree. But even before then, because the Army is going into the South and doing occupation duty, one of the things that we now have is a really impressive body of scholarship about Army occupation of the South. An occupation that begins well before the period that we typically call Reconstruction, right? And how occupation is what's really achieving change. And as you said, it's also true that, of course, enslaved people are running away and seizing their own freedom. And that begins before all of this. But for that freedom to be truly permanent, for the right, you need a system whereby, let's say, police authorities do not return runaways, so-called runaways, to their masters. You have to have the application of force in favor of emancipation. You have to have both. The enslaved people run away. They're not docile, and that's important because the Southern masters said, oh, they're going to be docile. They like slavery. Obviously, they put the lie to that right away. So yeah, you need an army. I don't think the Army starts Reconstruction. I happen to, you had Manisha Sinha on your here in the bookshop, as it were, recently, and we were just together with other historians in Washington D.C. at an event there, and she mentioned that for her, Reconstruction begins in 1860 with secession, and I agree. And the reason for me, at least, is that once you have a state declaring itself seceded, you can't think that you're just going to go back to the way things were easily, right? Something has to change. There has to be some kind of reconstruction. We don't know exactly what. So for me, that's the beginning of Reconstruction. But that's different from the question of who is going to be, who's doing the acting in Reconstruction, who's moving Reconstruction forward. And I think that's what you're getting at, which is, in many ways, it's the Army. Among other things. And the Army, especially, by 1863, and then even more so by 64 and 65, we're talking about these are black men in the Army, especially in these remote parts like Texas. These are black soldiers whose term of service was to go longer than most white soldiers because they signed up later. There are other reasons why the Army wanted them to stay in the field longer. That's another story. And so, yeah, the Army is doing this. And, it's a very old book, but still a very good one. James Sefton's The Army and Reconstruction. He takes you through all the numbers. He's got some wrong, as it turns out. But the basic idea that the Army is doing the work is correct.
Because there's so much more in this book. There's so much that you're going to want to read and grapple with yourself as Michael takes you through his various arguments about Reconstruction, the end of war. We haven't even really gotten into the Reconstruction Act, for instance. Here we happen to have an original of Andrew Johnson and Reconstruction, cartoonish, that came out in, I don't remember if this is Leslie's or Harper's that came from. And we have an original of it right now. And this
it's a Thomas Nast. The important part is it's Harper's. That's a Thomas Nast, and you can tell from the artwork.
Yeah, and he says so on the bottom here, right?
Yeah.
He writes it. And you explain this, what it is in the book, and goes into Andrew Johnson. I don't know if maybe you can just really briefly, elevator talk of what Andrew Johnson's view of that was, Reconstruction, and why he was Othello in that particular Nast cartoon.
I think in that one he's Iago.
Yeah,
that's okay. That's yes,
right.
And so the idea is that he's plotting He's not a true friend, right, to Othello,
Right.
who is the black veteran.
Yes.
And so look above his head, right? Treason is a crime and must be made odious, and traitors must be punished. So those are the words that Johnson says on a number of occasions when he, really soon after coming into office after Lincoln's assassinated. And it makes him out to be, he's going to be tough. He's going to be tougher than Lincoln. That's not someone who's saying, with malice toward none. He's talking about malice toward a lot. And so that is there in the image to contrast with what Johnson had become. That Johnson had, promised that he was going to push Reconstruction. He had told black people in Tennessee, "I shall be your Moses." But in fact, he betrays them. It takes a few months before people realize, and before Johnson himself realizes, I think,
Yeah.
just how conservative he is. And then he, of course, begins working against those efforts. His allies, the ones he seeks as allies, are the former elite Confederates. And so that image is meant to show that contrast. I didn't realize how sort of fixated I would get on Andrew Johnson during the writing of the book. I still think he's maybe one of our worst presidents, if not the worst. But he's a very detestable fellow, but he's fascinating. And I think what made him fascinating over time to me is I realized that in some ways his persona was a lot like our current president. Just in certain style, not the situations are quite different. But just as an example, Johnson was never happier than when he went on his speaking rally, his swing around the circle, and he would speak to a rally, and the people would energize him with their cheers. Now, in that time, presidents weren't supposed to leave the White House and give popular rallies. It just wasn't done. And Johnson gave nothing but horrible speeches that were formal speeches. His public addresses are terrible. But he loved being out on the road. And so that just reminded me a little bit, and I'm not trying to be critical of Trump here. I think he would agree that he enjoys speaking to crowds more than he does giving formal addresses. And so I just thought that was kind of interesting. But I have many other aspects of Johnson in the book that are fascinating and really quite detestable, quite honestly. But yes.
Yes, you go into Johnson quite a bit, I think, fairly to put him in his place in that position. And of course, he sent Grant in civilian clothes down on a southern tour that is in your book and fascinating. Other things that are in there. What about Mexico and the
Yeah.
Confederates who were thinking about with Maximilian or Joe Shelby? Whom would you go with in that? You get into detail. I think everyone would be interested in reading about that part as well. And of course, a chapter, at least more, on the Native Americans and their part of this story. And it's really quite compelling, the part. In fact, it's interesting how you talk about why many natives sided with the Confederates over slavery. Fascinating. And I think all of you should get into that. Another hour would be taken with that.
Well, I'll just say that in exploring the issue of the when was the war, I could not avoid the question of the where of the war. Mm-hmm. And I could have avoided it, but I chose not to. And that's what ended up making this book sort of also more interesting, a little bit more layered, and also maybe longer. Because as you say, the book takes you to places where we sort of forget that the war occurred. The borderlands with Texas, where there's a possible invasion of the U.S. into Texas, or I said Texas, into Mexico, excuse me. Native American struggles in the West, even into the North Pacific Ocean, where the Shenandoah, the Confederate ship Shenandoah is. That is still happening. That's another endpoint. The real endpoint, though, just to finish on Andrew Johnson here, I didn't really answer your question. So Johnson gives a proclamation August 20th, 1866. And that proclamation says that the war is over, the insurrection is at an end. And in many ways, that proclamation is what got my interest in the first place, because what I knew about that proclamation, I did not know that it was being used as the legal end date of the war, and is still today, I guess, legally, the legal end date, August 20th, 1866. The Supreme Court actually affirmed that that was the end date. Now, Congress fights against it and says, no, 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 we still want war powers, but they've passed this measure and just by accident acknowledge this proclamation in a way that the Supreme Court could say it's legitimate. So, holy cow, right? Andrew Johnson, of all people, ended the war by proclamation? Or is this going to be a satisfying end for any of us? I can hardly imagine it is. It isn't. And yet, legally, just in this narrow way, it is an endpoint. So that in itself is its own story in the book. And it's in some ways how I sort of caught the bug to go down this road when I found out that was not just a proclamation that we can dismiss, but the actual endpoint.
Yeah, no, interesting. Because when I entered the book, I was thinking LBJ and the Civil Rights Acts. I was thinking that's where you're going to point to. It's not ended if we're going to LBJ. So anyway,
although it's not, look, after LBJ, what do you get? I mean, it's going to be, Lee will be posthumously pardoned, and Jefferson Davis will be posthumously pardoned. So why do you need to pardon people posthumously if the war is over? Right? I mean, I know there's an answer to that, but this idea that you can find these moments even after LBJ with these issues, yes, absolutely, and. Right. So, although I want to be careful because I don't think that the war that was being fought in the 1860s is the same war. I am fairly strong opinion on that fact. I do not think that you can say simply, oh, we're still fighting the Civil War. We are fighting about the Civil War. We are fighting about the Civil War. We're arguing about the Civil War. And there are ideological struggles that have echoes of the Civil War. But we do not have armed people trying to kill each other in organized armies or guerrilla warfare and so forth over really important issues that hadn't been close to resolved, like, is slavery legal? Now, slavery today is illegal. The problem is, what is slavery? And so if you define it one way, then maybe it's legal. But if you define it another, then it's illegal. So we're still having those kinds of fights. But the idea that slavery was wrong and the idea that slavery is over dominate. So that even though we have a very conservative Supreme Court, the court says over and over again, slavery was an evil. The Dred Scott case was the worst case the court ever gave. I'm talking about today's court, right? They always invoke this stuff to make a break between, that ugly Supreme Court that was wrapped up in the system and today's Supreme Court. And that break is important because I don't think, people want to, if there's something like a war going on, it's a cold civil war. That might turn hot any day, I fear, but it is not the same civil war.
Yeah, I can see that. Yet issues still remain, as you know, because humans are humans. And the collapse of the Soviet Union was not the end of history. So two things now away from the 19th century and into today. I want to ask you make this quick. We're already 10 minutes over.
Yes. Yeah.
One is that Simon & Schuster, as a publisher, has roiled publishing with blurbs. They're not
wait. I have to cut you off. So it's Knopf. It's not Simon & Schuster.
Oh, is it?
No. I'm sorry. You're talking about something else. Simon & Schuster said no blurbs. The editor has said no blurbs.
And we'll see. Wonderful blurbs.
Yeah.
From people who have been on our show: John Meacham, Caroline Jenny, Tony Kushner, was on with the film. So blurbs. Really briefly, what is, as an author, what is your thought
Oh
on
gosh.
both the asking and having to write them?
Well, I didn't write them, so I can say
Oh,
that
you
much.
were not asked to write blurbs
And
for films?
I've written blurbs for people.
Yeah.
I honestly don't know. I think they are so ingrained in the book industry that even Simon and Schuster said, and I'm sorry I forget the editor's name, but it was a big story. He said, "Well, we will still accept voluntary endorsements that come in, and be willing to put them on the book. But what we
Mm.
will not do is solicit blurbs, right? We will not solicit endorsements. So what is that really going to look like, right? And I've got a feeling like it'll just kind of push underground what's now a little bit more above ground, which is, hey, could you just happen if you were to happen to send a letter or email, whatever, to the press, that wouldn't be the worst thing or something. I don't know. I don't know what the future is. Yeah, it is something that was just part of the, I don't know what to say, the ritual of publication, and
Publishing
I
culture.
acknowledged it, and quite frankly, I mean, before the blurbs, right? I sent out the manuscript to a number of historians who I acknowledge in the acknowledgments, and I relied on their goodwill, because without them, the book would have been filled with so many mistakes. I mean, I dread the fact that there probably are still mistakes there, but oh, the horrible mistakes that would have been there had it not been for these people who, out of the kindness of their heart, a couple of the people who blurbed the book, it was in an earlier draft, and they found some errors and alerted me, and thank goodness. And so I was able to fix things. I think you can focus on blurbs as, they're kind of fake praise or whatever. Look, these are serious people doing the serious work of reading, and they're not paid to do it. And I think it's important to remember that, yeah, we can badmouth blurbs, but there's a lot that goes on in the historical profession that is still quite noble, I would argue. And the
Mhm.
idea that people with no compensation, don't need, who are plenty famous on their own, would take the time to read a book because they care. Take the time then to give an author feedback, and then later down the line, maybe an endorsement for the book jacket. I mean, don't dismiss these things as easily done, right? I mean, I've given
Do they
blurbs.
work? Do they
Excuse me?
work? Do they make people go, oh, I've got to buy it?
Oh, I don't know. So there you'd have to. I think they give a certain legitimacy.
Hmm.
But I do think that an established author, a truly famous author, probably didn't need blurbs. I think they probably get them anyway, but they tend. But no, they don't. They probably don't need it as much, and so there probably is a kind of uh, quest for legitimacy. Like, hey, this, especially in something like the Civil War, if more books come out on the Civil War than any other topic, how does a reader know which is like the right one or the wrong one? And so, I think the
That's
thought
what
here
we're
is
here
interesting.
for at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, by the way.
And that is the answer. I mean, that would have been the answer. Is that in the days when there were bookstores or circulating, if you want to go back further, circulating libraries, that was the answer. Who had the books, and that took care of it for you. Now you have access to too many books, because of the online situation. But you're absolutely right. The curator took care of that for you. The bookstore owner.
Yeah, because we curate our books and we want people to come back. We want them to understand and enjoy what they're reading so that they will come back. That's one of the reasons, besides disseminating and uh, popularizing good books. And one other, again, quick, please. You're at Brown University. They have quite a Lincoln collection. Not really being used much today, I fear. I wish it was. Uh, what do you think? Have you gone into the Hay Library and and the collection of Lincolniana that they have there?
I use it all the time, and so do my students. I teach a first-year seminar on Lincoln all the time, where using the collection is crucial. For those who don't know, uh, John Hay, Lincoln's personal secretary, who would then later on become Secretary of State, was a Brown alum, and it's mostly Hay's collection, although that's given to what is now the John Hay Library. That's the Rare Book Library, and then that's the foundation. But then they collect all these other things. So it is one of the best Lincoln collections around. They have digitized much of their stuff, but it doesn't matter. There's nothing like handling the actual documents and objects themselves, and it is a remarkable collection. So I think people are using it because I'm making them if they're my students. Not always, but I do. And when I go to the Hay, there are people using it. But you're right. It's probably not getting as much use as it might have once, mainly because of digitization. That's true of many libraries.
Well, I wish you'd have some symposia there and bring Lincoln obsessives to you. I'm going, Bjorn, I'm sorry about this. I'm going to do one more thing because I want to. And that is the cover of your book, The Peacemakers, is important. And we happen to have a letter from Assistant Secretary of Navy Fox under Gideon Wells, where on March 23rd of 1865, he's ordering that the River Queen, accompanied by the Bat, take the president down to City Point for what became the Peacemakers. Here is the order to do that. You can see River Queen right in there.
Yes.
And Bjorn has a slide of the entire Peacemakers oil that Healy did with that rainbow of hope. And I think hope is a big part of any end of conflict. It may not end that way later. Reconstruction might not end the way you're hoping right there, and that is the end. But nonetheless, that is what I think the Peacemakers certainly show. Any comment?
Well, I'm just going to tell folks what the Peacemakers is if they don't know. So the Peacemakers is a painting done by George P.A. Healy in 1868. And actually, the original is enormous. It was life-size. And that ended up getting destroyed. But fortunately, he had made a smaller version. And that's what you're looking at. And it depicts the meeting that occurs in City Point on the River Queen on March 28th. And so the book, the first chapter begins with Lincoln leaving the White House to go down to City Point, and the River Queen becomes effectively his office for almost 2 weeks. And that River Queen is where he meets with Sherman and Grant, and the other fellow is David Dixon Porter, the top admiral of that area. And so
East, West, and Navy.
Excuse me?
East,
West, and Navy. Correct, exactly. Yeah, and as you say, with the rainbow behind. So that's the painting, and it's called The Peacemakers. And so this idea of that making a peace, right? Lincoln went to make a peace. That's what he did. That's what he's doing on the cover of my book. He's not making it with his generals, but he's telling his generals and admiral, this is how you're going to make the peace, right? That's the idea of the painting. And then, of course, it doesn't work out quite the way as people might have hoped in the at that meeting. Yes, and so
read the book is what I'm saying. If you want to get
read the book, and then you can also find out what happens to the painting itself, because the painting itself has its own story
with
and what happens to that.
Book plate. Yes. Michael, thank you so much. This was fun. 20 minutes late.
I'm sorry that we kept folks too long, but thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Bjorn, and thank you to the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. It's always just to say the words. It just brings back fond memories of visiting there, and yes, and your broadcast is wonderful, and so thank you for the work you do.